The police in Brighton stated that they would deploy more patrols on the streets during the full moon, as their data indicates an increase in crime rates on these days. 80% of specialists in the field of psychiatry believe that people's conditions may worsen during the full moon. Medical staff report that more patients are admitted during full moon. All of this is true. Not in the sense that the full moon actually affects people, but there really was an increase in patrols during the full moon in England. And according to some surveys, a significant portion of professionals in psychiatry believe in the moon's influence. And it's easy to imagine an exhausted paramedic saying, "Oh, is it a full moon tonight?" Hearing about the influence of celestial bodies on people, many will probably think of astrology. And those folks, of course, love to talk about the full moon too. But that's not the topic today. Today we're talking about a purely scientific attempt to determine whether the moon can actually have a noticeable effect on people, their mood, behavior, whether it can trigger aggression or impact health. There have been many claims about this, but there's a big difference between subjective stories and real-life examples and scientific studies. And even in the latter case, you can find examples with very different conclusions. You might even come across some tabloid article that says that it is scientifically proven that the full moon affects people. And it might even include a link to a legitimate scientific paper. So where's the truth? Can the moon really influence people? What evidence is there for and against such an influence? What could be the mechanism of this influence? We'll talk about all this and more today. I'm Andre, and this is Cosmos Elementary. Surely you've come across someone trying to blame the fact that everything went wrong that day on the full moon. Similar to how some people blame everything on retrograde Mercury, though this one probably comes up more often. Usually it's just a common superstition, and people don't really try to analyze this and don't think about how it could possibly work or why the full moon might have any influence on them. What could be the mechanism here? The mechanisms aren't really considered even by those who call themselves professionals. Here I'm of course referring to astrologers. And this is a true story. I once even asked a bunch of astrologers how exactly the position of stars and planets in the sky should influence people's character and behavior. Through what mechanism this influence occurs. But none of them were able to give me a reasonable answer. But the situation with the moon is interesting. As I mentioned, there are scientific studies on the so-called lunar effect. There are even articles with certain positive results, and researchers also address the mechanisms of influence. So for charlatans, it's a bit easier in this case. They don't have to invent magical mechanisms of influence or drag in quantum effects without understanding them at all. Like in an article, in Cosmopolitan, where they explain how we feel calm during the new moon, but during the first quarter moon we start feeling worse and then it just keeps getting worse from there. Yeah, the entire population of Earth. Such an article with obvious nonsense might even include a reference to a legitimate scientific paper, and they might have actually taken something real from it. But then they added their own nonsense on top. But it's important to remember that a scientific paper in itself is not a guarantee. They can also vary in quality. You may have heard of the concept of junk or predatory journals. They are supposed to be scientific journals with very low and sometimes actually non-existent standards, where for a bit of money you can publish almost anything. So if we want to verify something, the mere presence of an academic DOI link shouldn't automatically reassure us. And let's face it, even in prestigious scientific journals, sometimes articles are published and then later have to be retracted or corrected because the authors made mistakes, used flawed methods, or their results were disproven by other researchers. And scientists can make mistakes, be biased, or not always very thorough. In general, it's clear how a tabloid article can pick one study and write something like, scientists have proven, or undeniable facts, and so on. But especially when it comes to such a global issue, it's important to look at it in a much broader context. We need to study a large body of literature, look at the sample sizes of different studies, and check if there are any meta-analyses that gather multiple studies and analyze their results. In general, it is worth mentioning that, unlike the imagined influence on, say, Alice, of the specific positions of chunks of rocks and gas spheres far away from us, billions and trillions of kilometers or miles away, that depends on the specific time of birth, the moon and the sun, both directly and indirectly, have indeed influenced all of us in one way or another. And here, the mechanisms are quite clear. The photons from the sun allow life to exist. The moon, like the sun to a lesser extent, causes tides, and there are reasons to believe that tides have influenced the evolution of life on Earth. And the interaction between the moon and Earth, along with tidal forces, has slowed down the rotation of our planets. In general, people often talk about the important role the moon played in the evolution of life on Earth, and without it, things would likely be very different today. But here, of course, we're talking about something else entirely. However, we will bring up tides again later, though in a much stranger context. People all over the world have believed for thousands of years that the moon somehow influences them. For example, here is a tablet from 172 BC from Mesopotamia. If you haven't read what's written here yourself, it says how to ward off the evil influence of a lunar eclipse which could harm the king. However, the moon was also given a completely opposite significance. This is a lunula. It's an ancient Roman amulet, and the ancient Greeks also had similar ones. They were worn by girls and women, and it was believed that they possessed apotropaic magic. In other words, they warded off curses, repelled evil spirits, and helped women in childbirth. And what do you think of this device? This is a medieval volvo, a special circular chart. Its black section was used to track the position of the moon, and it was used in medicine. For example, it was believed that bloodletting would be more effective during the waxing phases of the moon. A full moon, on the other hand, could worsen the conditions of patients with a fever. There are many similar examples to be found. But perhaps it wouldn't surprise many that people believed in such things during the Middle Ages and even more so 2,000 years ago. But it's interesting that modern claims about the moon's influence on people often echo what people believed hundreds of years ago. Besides the general statements about the moon's influence on health and behavior, there are also more specific claims. When it comes to health, for example, you might come across claims that a full moon affects the cardiovascular system and influences blood pressure. There have been some studies on this. For example, here's an article in which the authors found some correlation between the phases of the moon and blood pressure. Allegedly, the blood pressure of the experiment participants dropped by about 5 mm during the full moon and new moon phases. And during tests with physical activities, during these phases, their heart rate returned to normal more quickly. In the end, the authors of the study concluded that during the full moon and new moon phases, people handle physical activity better. And you'll say, well, there you go, evidence. But this study, conducted on athletes, found no connection between the phases of the moon and athletic performance. And another study, which focused on patients with type 2 diabetes, found no correlation between the phases of the moon and blood pressure, heart rate, and sugar levels in the patients. So what's the deal? One study says one thing and two others say the exact opposite, especially for ordinary people who won't or can't dive into details, compare the quality of journals, assess the methodology of the studies, check the citations, and so on. In these studies, the sample size or number of people involved in these studies is not radically different. It is in the ballpark of dozens. So it's one thing if one study has 100 people and the other has 10,000. But in the case of these particular papers, that is not the case. But let's see what else we've got. In 1708, the work of Dr. Richard Meade, titled Discourse Concerning the Action of the Sun and Moon on Animal Bodies and the Influence which this may have in many diseases, was published. He wrote that celestial bodies could affect epilepsy seizures, kidney, and women's cycles. The idea of a connection between the moon and the female menstrual cycle is indeed very old. The logic behind this belief is that the lunar cycle lasts about a month, and so does the average length of the menstrual cycle. Coincidence? But it seems like it's something that wouldn't be too difficult to check. Even with that research, it's obvious that the cycles of not all women on the planet are synchronized, and they don't even last the same amount of time. Well, in general, we need to take data from a large number of people and compare it. And of course, this has been done. And for example, this study where the authors found a certain connection between the phases of the moon and women's cycles. But there's already a second but. And I think that you can guess where this but is leading. How many participants were in this study? 22. Yes, not the largest sample size. There are a few other studies where the sample sizes range from a few dozen to a couple of hundred. And here's a 2021 study which involved 529 women, and they didn't find any connection in it. But, okay, 529. The analysis of data from the Clue cycle tracker also showed no dependence on the lunar phases. And just to note, we're talking not about a few hundred, but about 7.5 million women. The smaller your sample size, the higher the chance that you will just get random coincidences. However, when the pool is so large, it's no longer possible to just chalk everything up to randomness. And overall, here it seems that there is no real correlation. There's also another fairly popular idea that the phases of the moon affect our sleep. And here it almost seems like there is some logic to it. Which would be easier for you to fall asleep in? Complete darkness, or if a flashlight is shining in your face? And a full moon is quite a flashlight. Amateur astronomers know what I'm talking about. There are studies on this as well. For example, here's a 2013 study, and the authors again found a certain correlation. During the full moon, volunteers spent 30% less time in deep sleep, and on average it took them 5 minutes longer to fall asleep. So it turns out that the moonlight does interfere. But what's strange is that the experiment was conducted in a lab where the amount of light was controlled. So how is this even related? Anyway, once again we see some positive results. But 2 other studies were unable to replicate the result of the first one, and the researchers found no connection between the phases of the moon and sleep. It seems like a trend is emerging. One of the most extraordinary claims is that the moon drives people insane. Popular culture adds to this with werewolves and stuff, but we're obviously not talking about that right now. The word lunacy comes from the word luna, which is the moon. But lunacy more commonly means madness. Do we have any modern data on whether the moon affects people's mental state and behavior? This question can be approached from 2 sides. For example, we could take a specific mental disorder and see if there's any correlation with the phases of the moon. Another approach could be to look at statistics on crimes or admissions to psychiatric hospitals and check if there is any correlation with the phases of the moon. And the first could be related to the second. For example, if certain disorders worsen, it could lead to an increase in the number of crimes. At least that's the logic sometimes presented. Let's take a look at the first aspect. Here, there are examples of studies related to bipolar disorder. In 2017, a study was published that looked at people with bipolar disorder. In the end, the authors seemingly found a connection with the moon. Specifically, the cycles of switching between depression and mania appeared to synchronize with the lunar phases. More precisely, the patient's sleep patterns changed, and this in turn led to a certain pattern in the transition between stages. But this study with positive results is more of an exception, and it was conducted on only 17 patients. However, there have been many studies attempting to find a connection between the moon and mental health or people's well-being in one way or another. In 1978, scientists analyzed 16 studies that looked at aspects like admissions to psychiatric institutions, murders, self-harm, and so on. They found no connection, and any positive results were attributed to errors. By the way, although this review is not the newest, the situation here is different from, say, studies in astrophysics, where over a few decades, technology has advanced incredibly. We've got more advanced telescopes, powerful computers, and so on. The difference in available methods here isn't that radical. In 1985, a similar meta-analysis was conducted on 37 studies, and the results were essentially the same. The authors concluded that the lunar phases accounted for at most 1% of the variations. More importantly, the hypothesis that the moon affects mental health failed to meet three key criteria: reproducibility, statistical significance, and predictability. But that's not all. Another review from 1992, analyzing 20 studies over nearly 28 years, also found no connection. Similar studies were conducted later as well, such as this one from 1997, one of the more recent studies, 2019 research that used data from not 17 but 18,000 patients, found no correlation between the moon and human mental health. There were no more psychiatric admissions either. The situation with crime is similar. While I was writing the script for this video and reading various materials, I came across an interesting example. Supposedly, in the 80s of the 19th century in England, a certain Charles Hyde managed to successfully avoid a murder charge by claiming that the full moon had influenced him. And again, supposedly, this became the prototype for a strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. It's funny that I couldn't find any reliable sources about this matter, or even about Charles Hyde himself. At best, this story is mentioned in questionable tabloid articles, of course without any references to sources, and even those contradict each other. Some say he managed to avoid charges, while others say he didn't. And Stevenson never mentioned or wrote about using any Charles as a prototype. Claims that the crime rates increased during the full moon are about as reliable as such stories. Instead of relying on anecdotes, we should look at studies. And here's one from 2009, based on 23,000 cases. Or here's another one from 2016, and this is not all. In general, no increase in crime during the full moon has been observed. And yet in 2007, the police in Brighton did indeed announce that they would be increasing patrols during the full moon. Well, after all, in some countries, officials or higher-ups do sometimes use astrologers' services. So why not this? In general, we see that in most cases, especially with large sample sizes, scientists find no connection between the phases of the moon and people's behavior or health. Though some positive results do occasionally appear, they're still quite rare. How is this supposed to work, at least in theory? How could the moon physically influence us? If we want to consider the question of the moon's influence on people seriously, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the mechanism of influence. After all, we're not astrologers. We can't just blindly claim that there is an influence and ignore how exactly it manifests. And scientists, when writing articles on this topic, always address the question of the mechanism of influence. So how could the moon, at least in theory, drive us mad? I would highlight two main proposed mechanisms, although others are discussed as well. The main one is, well, quite obviously moonlight. The second, somewhat less obvious, the tides. If we want to be, well, very generous, we can call the conclusions about the moon's influence on people ambiguous. But there's more confidence when it comes to the idea that the phases of the moon affect certain animals. For example, the reproductive cycle of light-sensitive corals like this one seems to be tied to the lunar cycle. The spawning of these corals begins at the specific time in the lunar cycle. The exact mechanism is still unknown, but scientists suspect that the moonlight plays a role. Experiments have been conducted that support this. There are also other examples in animals. Well, if the light reflected by the moon and the fact that its intensity changes with the phases can affect animals, then why wouldn't it affect humans? And it does, or at least it's quite possible that it had a noticeable impact in the past. Before the advent of gas and then electric lighting, the bright full moon and the surrounding phases allowed people to work outdoors, something much harder to do in the dark. As a result, people would go to sleep later. And some people might have even lived outdoors entirely. The bright moon in the sky could certainly interfere with sleep. And less sleep, along with poorer sleep quality, can certainly affect both physical and mental health. It's quite possible that this is one of the sources of the belief in the moon's influence on people. But now, when most of us live in brightly lit cities even at night, and also such high-tech inventions as, well, curtains exist, it seems like the influence of the full moon could be nowhere near as impactful as it was hundreds or thousands of years ago. And some sleep experiments I mentioned were sometimes conducted in conditions where the amount of light was controlled. Overall, the moonlight as a mechanism of influence doesn't seem like a very convincing candidate today. Maybe then it's the tides? This argument is the one I really love. It's often brought up by astrologers as an example of some celestial body having a noticeable influence on Earth. In pseudoscientific articles about the influence of the moon, this is usually the main argument. And when you hear it, it will either seem incredibly dumb to you or quite convincing. You've probably heard the claim that the human body is 70% water. In reality, it's difficult to pinpoint the exact percentage, and it changes with age, but one way or another, water is a significant part of our body mass. Can you sense where this is going? The moon causes tides. And where do we see tides? In the ocean. We are largely made of water, so the moon also influences us, creating a sort of tide in our bodies. And that could potentially affect our health and mind. I can understand why some people might be satisfied with such an explanation. You can find some logic in it. It won't sit well with those who understand how tidal forces work though, and in fact this idea is certainly not new. Aristotle also believed that due to the high water content in our brains, they could be susceptible to the influence of the moon and tides. Yes, even back then, tides were associated with the moon and the sun. However, the mechanism of their influence on humans remained a mystery. And as we can see, the idea has survived to this day. In the 20th century, for example, psychiatrist Arnold Slieber's book, The Lunar Effect, Biological Tides and Human Emotions was published. The book is still being published, by the way. He wrote that the moon, by exerting gravitational influence on the human body, causes cyclical changes in the flow of water in the body's water compartments. But what's wrong with this line of thinking? In fact, the gravitational influence of the moon on us does exist. But, if we're being really picky, the emphasis is placed on the fact that we're made of water. And tides are related to water. The association is built primarily on that. But tidal forces don't affect just water. Gravity and tidal forces affect the planet itself, and as a result, it regularly deforms. The effect is not as noticeable as in the case of the oceans, but it is still measurable. The Earth's surface can fluctuate by several tens of centimeters. But still, the most noticeable effect is on the oceans. By the way, have you ever noticed tides on a lake? Neither have I. By the way, this is sometimes used by flat Earth proponents. They claim, how come your moon can pull entire oceans, but it can't pull a little lake? The larger the scale, the more noticeable the effect. And it turns out that the world's ocean is the largest connected body of water on Earth. When you have a massive planetary scale, the effects become noticeable. But in a small lake, the effect is not noticeable. Although the effect is still there, it's just very weak. As for our bodies, undoubtedly both the moon and the sun with their gravitational pull do affect us. And the tidal forces arising from the interaction of bodies also have an effect. But these effects are so tiny that any action in your body, heartbeat, breathing, blood flow, is magnitudes more powerful. The article in Scientific American quotes the words of astronomer George Abel. He says that a mosquito sitting on our arm exerts a more powerful gravitational pull on us than the moon does. In short, the moon's influence on an individual is so small that it's overshadowed by everything happening inside and around us. Overall, it seems like tidal forces are not such an impactful mechanism after all. In some works, tidal forces are used as an intermediary. The idea is that it's not tidal forces directly affecting us, but rather the interaction between the Earth and the Moon, which affects the Earth's magnetic field, and the changes in the magnetic field in turn influence us. However, there are also questions here, considering that an ordinary magnet is tens of times stronger than the Earth's magnetic field. Yet we don't go crazy every time we approach the refrigerator with a bunch of magnets on it. In general, most studies do not find a connection between the phases of the moon and the state of humans. Those studies that do find a connection are usually based on a small sample, or there are questions about the methodology. There is also no clear mechanism of influence. So why do people continue to believe in this, including doctors, psychiatrists, and police officers? Here we can thank good old cognitive biases and false correlations. It's a tendency for people to remember an incident or something unusual while easily forgetting situations where nothing special happened. For example, something bad happened to us during a full moon. We noticed that it happened exactly during the full moon. We formed an association and remembered it. But the fact that nothing happened during the other 100 full moons, we tend to ignore. Something similar happens with our far from perfect brains when it comes to other superstitions. When I started writing this script, I wanted to make a video about both the moon and the sun's influence on people, but there was just too much information, so probably I'm going to make a separate video about the sun. Thanks for watching. Links to all of the sources are, as always, down below in the description, and if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment and subscribe for more videos in future. Bye!